I'm Jack Berryman, the ACSM historian, and we're here this afternoon talking with Mike Joyner. Welcome, Mike, as part of ACSM's Distinguished Leaders in Sports Medicine and Exercise DVD series. Mike, I just wanted to start with a little bit about your early life,
right,
where you grew up, high school,
right,
that type of thing.
I was born in Lafayette, Louisiana, and my family moved to Tucson when I was 3 in 1961. My dad was a faculty member at the University of Arizona in political science.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And I went to Rincon High School and graduated in 1976. And after kind of a year floating around at several universities, I landed back in Tucson, where I went to undergraduate and medical school.
I'll be darned. So, going back to high school, did you play any sports? Or?
Yeah, I played basketball mostly, but at the end of my junior year, I got involved in distance running.
Oh. Okay.
And became a pretty good distance runner relatively quickly, even though I'm kind of a big guy to be a distance runner.
Yeah.
And at the end of high school, I ran a 4:27 mile.
Wow.
With just to my first year in track.
And just starting, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And
wow,
then I started to run in college and continued to run in college.
At Arizona?
You bet.
Yeah, okay.
You bet.
All right.
I like to tell people I was good enough to get lapped by Alberto Salazar in the Pac-10 championship.
Did you go up and run in Oregon, too, in Eugene?
Seattle, the Pac-10 championship.
Oh, well, they were in Seattle.
Seattle, my junior year, and Stanford my senior year. And in Seattle, it was right after Mount St. Helens had blown up. About a week
There's
after
still
that.
Dust.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and we were flying in, and you could see the plume kind of head off into the jet stream.
Yeah.
And the person who won the race there was a Kenyan from Washington State called Samson Kamambwa, who had been the world record holder.
I'll be darned.
So, and again, I was good enough to be lapped by him as well.
So you were running the mile?
About 10,000 meters.
10,000, okay. Wow. And then, so what years are you undergrad then at Arizona?
77 to 81.
Okay. Did you go to med school right out of there? Or
no,
what?
I had been a kind of a marginal student my first couple of years of college. And
I know that. I'm that same way.
I did a year of academic rehab, and where I worked with Jack Wilmore.
Oh, how nice.
And then I got into medical school.
So were you taking prereqs for med school, or were you sort of doing things that Wilmore recommended?
Kind of both.
Okay.
Kind of both.
Okay. Is that, so your undergrad major?
Nutrition and food science.
I'll be darned. Okay.
Yeah, I had, once I decided to become a more serious student after about 18 months in college, I wanted to get something that fulfilled the pre-med prereqs, but also was a bit more scientific. And at that time, exercise science had really not emerged, or kinesiology, and what we call it now. And there was still kind of a strong physical education department in Tucson that didn't have the hard science. Jack and a man named Fred Roby were making that trend.
I remember Fred and his wife.
Mary recently died. Yeah. She was a long-time women's athletic director and then associate athletic director.
Right, I remember them.
So anyways, they were just making the transition to kind of the exercise science model, and so Jack and others had actually recommended that I go the nutrition and food science route, because physical education and the nutrition program had a strong link there, which continues to this day.
Did you take any exercise phys then as an undergrad?
You bet. I took some exercise phys as an undergrad, and actually I got started as a subject in Pete Farrell's dissertation.
I'll be darned.
His classic study on the lactate threshold.
And you were one of the guinea pigs, so to speak.
Well, and Eddie Coyle, who was another graduate school of Jack's.
He's at Texas now.
You bet.
Yeah.
Eddie and I was out running a race, and Eddie and I chatted during the race in 1977, of all times, and Eddie recruited me to be a subject.
Very neat. Now, Tipton hadn't gotten there
Tipton didn't get there till the middle 80s.
So he's still at Iowa.
Yeah, so this is like 77, 78, 79.
Okay.
So I was like 19, 20 years old.
Yeah. Good stuff happening early on.
I was very lucky because I got to be a subject in the lab and really got interested in it, and Eddie and Pete answered all my questions.
Right.
And then Dr. Wilmore told me that I could work more in the lab once I started getting better grades.
Right. That was motivation.
It didn't take much.
Yeah, and you're doing stuff that you liked right away,
it was great.
With the running. And
great.
And as
You
you're
bet.
a subject, you want to know more about it,
You
so
bet.
you're learning right on the spot.
And what happens, I think what people forget is that research universities like the University of Arizona can be these big impersonal places. But as a young person, if you can get into a micro environment,
Yes.
and actually get in, you actually have a chance to participate in the cutting edge generation of knowledge very, very early on.
Right.
And I think, obviously key faculty members like Dr. Wilmore are important, but also the graduate students and the postdoctoral fellows really set the environment because they're in there in the day-to-day data collection and so forth.
Yeah, that's what I try to tell my undergrads because they're so shy.
Yeah, right,
They-
exactly.
They don't want to meet anyone. And
Right.
Then it comes time for a letter of recommendation
They
for
don't
med
know.
school, and they don't know
Right,
anyone.
exactly. And I think, again, there's some advantages to smaller schools in terms of that personal attention. But if a kid can branch out and tap into the vast resources at the research universities, you'll never have a better experience.
Yeah, they're doing things that other students wouldn't dream of.
And I think most people don't understand how welcoming
I agree.
people are.
agree.
Somebody just has to knock on the door.
Yes, I agree. That's hard to get across
Yeah.
sometimes to
Well, you're
undergrads.
18 or 19 years
Yeah.
old and first time away from home, so forth.
Yep. You do that year with Wilmore.
Right.
Apply to med school.
Yeah, you got into med school.
I forgot you probably said, was it at Arizona?
Arizona. But
Yeah, okay.
one important thing is after my senior year of college, before I took this year off, Eddie Coyle had moved to Wash U.
I never knew he was over there.
And to do a postdoc
in
with
St.
John
Louis
Hollis.
with
You bet.
John.
Yeah. He'd done a postdoc with John Hollisy,
Yep.
and they were doing a detraining study, which is now a famous study, and I was
Yeah.
a subject in the detraining study.
Oh my.
So I was also exposed very early on to what happened in really a top lab in the world, or perhaps the top lab in the world, led by a true intellectual giant, Dr.
John,
Hollisy.
yeah, he's amazing.
And so I had this wonderful experience with Dr. Wilmore when I was 19 or 20 years old, and Eddie and Pete, and then to go immediately and see what John Hollisy was doing in a high-powered medical environment was a real eye-opener.
What an
So I like to
amazing
tell people I'm lucky that it's a little bit like acquiring a second language at a very early age. So I started thinking about researching these things before my brain had turned to concrete.
Isn't that? So were you able to be a subject without leaving Tucson?
No,
or
no,
did you have to go to
I went to St. Louis that summer, lived in St. Louis,
all right.
and
Okay.
stopped training and watched my VO2 max go from around 70
Thus the detraining study.
to around 56, 57.
How many subjects did they have?
There
in
were
that
only
study?
7 of us, and we had muscle biopsies and did these very intensive studies. A number of papers published in the JAP or the American Journal of Physiology that have been cited hundreds of times
From that.
from that very study.
From that.
You
Muscle biopsies aren't fun either.
Well,
so-
Eddie was good at them.
That helps, right?
You bet.
So med school then.
Right. So then I started med school in 1982, but again, I was on kind of the slow track like I was as an undergraduate, and I spent an extra year in med school getting research training. There was a terrific woman at the University of Arizona, she's still there, called Marlise Whitty, who runs a program on medical ignorance. And she was very instrumental in getting medical students to ask questions instead of look for answers. And she arranged some funding so I could work with Dr. Wilmore and a man named Doug Stewart over in the med school, who's a neuroscientist. And
Was this after you were admitted?
no,
So-
this was after I admitted, so I did 2 years of med school and part of my third year.
Okay.
Then I took a year out of med school into the lab, and then I finished up. So it took me 5
Wow.
years. So
Wow.
it took me 5 years to be an undergraduate, and a year of academic rehab, then 5 years to be a medical student. So I've been slow my whole life.
It's quality.
Yeah,
not
quality
quantity.
counts, you
Yeah,
bet.
that's the.
You
Take
bet.
your time.
You bet. And we did some studies during that year off. I worked with Bo Freund, who's now been involved with USARIUM, who's in the Army. Bo's a colonel and a physiologist in the Army. We did some studies on how beta blockers affect exercise tolerance. Again, published them in the Journal of Applied Physiology, and these papers are still cited today.
Isn't it? Wow. Wow.
And they were a lot of fun. Learned a lot.
Yeah, yeah. And were you sort of an oddity in medical school looking at exercise, Mike? Or
I was an oddity in terms of a medical student who really wanted to take a deep dive into research.
Yeah,
That's
that,
maybe-
that in itself.
Yeah,
of course.
And that's more common, I think, at some of the bigger, more established schools on the East Coast, the Ivy League, Stanford, but in a state school, it's unusual. And I think I was unusual in being interested in exercise, but not totally atypical.
The research was more unique than the subject, I guess. Okay. And then you did residency, or what?
Well, what happened toward the end of medical school, I started thinking about what I was going to do, and I initially thought I'd go to cardiology or pulmonology because the obvious link with exercise.
Yeah, yeah.
And I was doing a surgical rotation, and I saw what the anesthesiologists do, which is measure heart rate, blood pressure, gas exchange, and other things. I said, this looks like an exercise test in somebody who's asleep.
I wondered how you...
And it's sort of the flip side of the same coin. And when we think about exercise physiology, we think about how the brainstem controls the cardiovascular system, blood pressure, thermoregulation, breathing, things like that. And we turn that off during anesthesia, and the anesthesiologist essentially becomes the patient's brainstem. So to understand...
So you're controlling all
Yeah,
of that,
you're a kind
basically.
of a... so if you're interested in physiological control, there's nothing like exercise and environmental physiology on the research side, and there's nothing like anesthesia and critical care
I see
on the medical side. So,
Very interesting.
so it actually makes more sense than people think when you kind of walk them through it.
Now that you said it,
Yeah.
it makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. And so then I only applied it at places for residency where there was strong exercise programs or investigators, and I'd become quite interested in skeletal muscle blood flow as a key determinant of exercise performance and other things. And John Shepard was at the Mayo Clinic and physiology there. And the physiology program at Mayo had and has a strong link to anesthesia and vice versa. So I was able to work with John while I was doing my clinical residency.
Wow.
So
Right place again at
right
the right
place
time.
at the right time. And that interest in muscle blood flow had also been stimulated by Doug Seals, because we were talking about Charlie Tipton.
Yeah.
Tip came to Arizona in the middle 80s, and then Doug came shortly afterwards. Jack had left to go to the University of Texas, so I was looking for people to collaborate with the last couple of years of med school, and Doug was very, very helpful, and I was able to do some studies with him as well. So, whenever I wasn't working in the hospital, I was over in the lab.
Have you stuck in anesthesiology?
I'm an
then?
anesthesiologist,
Okay.
you bet,
Okay.
and stayed there, although I have a large funded lab now, and I don't do as much clinical work as I used to. I only do about 1 day a week.
I wondered. Okay.
Yeah.
But you're still
Yeah, oh yeah, I like
keeping
it.
your hand in it.
Yeah, it's fun.
Was it Wilmore then that introduced you to ACSM?
Yeah, I don't know. I think so, because you started reading MSSE right away. There was a regional meeting up in Las Vegas that we used to have all the time, and it just seemed like the normal thing to do. And people were going to the ACSM meeting, and I'm sure I went to one in the early 80s, or some of the regional meetings. Plus, there was kind of a statewide meeting between Arizona State, and Northern Arizona University, and people would meet at one of the campuses and present abstracts and so
That's
forth.
a good idea too.
So it just seemed kind of like the normal ecology of the situation was to be part of ACSM.
Yeah, and like you said, if you're really looking at the literature, probably a lot of it had been published in MSSE.
You bet, you bet.
So that would draw you to
You
it
bet.
as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
And especially at that time, because there was so much interest in distance running and endurance performance. And a lot of it, really the good stuff. Pete's dissertation, for example, was published there
Okay.
on the lactate threshold. And again, it's still a seminal paper.
In MSSE.
You bet.
Yeah, yeah. Currently, you're still at Mayo.
You bet.
Right?
I went there in 1987 and I haven't left.
Okay. That's worked out okay.
Yeah, I don't think I will either. I think I'll probably
Why?
leave Rochester, Minnesota feet first.
Yeah, and so how long did it take before you could get a lab going and that type of
Well,
thing?
I had to do my clinical residency, but
Which is why you went there in
the
the first place.
But again, we had a very flexible chairman, a man named Alan Sessler, and he worked closely with Dr. Shepard to carve out time and resources. And there was a man named Kai Rader, who is a well-known pulmonary physiologist, and Kai was very helpful as well. And so they began to carve out resources. And just like I took extra time in med school,
Yeah.
I took extra time in residency to spend blocks in the lab and get some additional research training. So what should have been 4 years really took 5.5.
Okay.
And I was able to keep publishing papers, begin to get small grants, and begin to kind of establish a team even that some of who are still with me today.
And it's interesting because your interest in research started way back.
Yeah, right.
And I mean, you were
It started
really early.
It started in December
stayed.
when I met Eddie and Pete in December of 1977.
Wow.
Yeah, so again, I feel like I said, I feel quite lucky I started early.
Yeah, and with a lot of good people.
Yeah,
too.
and you stumbled into it. I mean, Dr. Wilmore had come to Arizona recently, and they were making the transition from kind of the physical education model. There were good people in nutrition, supportive people in the med school. Then I had this tremendous opportunity to meet John Hollisey early.
Yeah, what a key figure.
And then go work with Dr. Shepard and be in a resource-rich environment at Mayo where it's normal for physicians to also do kind of hardcore physiologic research.
Okay, I didn't know if that was the
Yeah,
case.
we have
or
a
not.
big clinical research unit and a long history of this.
Is it all together? I mean,
Yeah,
all right.
we've carved it out, and later in my career I've had a leadership role in that. So we have a big clinical research unit. We've developed an exercise lab in the clinical research unit, body composition capabilities.
Oh, wow.
We can do stable isotopes, muscle biopsies, invasive catheters, measure gas exchange, you name it. And
Nice.
we've set all that up over the last 20 years and really kind of grown it.
Did you get tied in with the annual Tipton Dinner through the Arizona
Yeah, through the
connection?
Arizona connection, yeah, I got tied in with that, and also one of the great things about Dr. Tipton is that you occasionally, from time to time, if he's working on a book, get large manila envelopes in your inbox, because frequently, I'm not sure he's into attachments yet in PDFs on on the email. And so you get these hard copies with instructions to review things, edit things, give him feedback.
And there's this thick
There-
paper
yeah,
manuscript.
right. And of course, because of his many contributions to everything, you just do it. And so I think I've been invited also as a reward for occasional editorial services to Dr. Tipton.
Yeah, I didn't get an invitation this year.
Yeah.
So I emailed Ken Baldwin,
And what did he say?
and he said, well, I'll check with Tip. Well, he had been sending it to a wrong
No, email. And it probably was bouncing, he didn't know.
And he apologized.
Yeah,
He said, it's my computer skills.
Yeah, right.
So-
I should digress slightly. At the very last couple months of med school, I was done with all my clinical rotations and had a couple months off. And Mike Overton, who's now at Florida State, was one of Tip's graduate students down there, and was doing these studies in rats with hypertensive rats and looking at the effects of acute exercise. And I went down and helped Mike do that study as well on PostExercise Hypotension, a subject we've later studied in humans. So I too get to be one of the many lucky people who get to have been a co-author with Tip.
Yeah, and rats.
Yeah, so that was one of
Which
my
goes
very
way
limited.
back.
Yeah, one of my very, very limited animal experiments. Almost everything I've done's been humans.
Humans, yeah. When he was telling me when he started, it was all rats and maybe dogs.
Yeah,
With their lab work,
Right.
of course.
right.
So maybe go back a little bit too, Mike, and talk about sort of the way your research has
Progressed.
over time.
Yeah, you know, when you look back on it, it makes an awful lot of sense. So I first got interested in the limits of human performance because of this participation in this lactate threshold study. So if you're going to be interested in the limits of human performance, you're going to be interested in maximal oxygen uptake, among other things. So then the next series of studies were these beta blocker studies and the influence of beta blockers on maximal oxygen uptake. And when I had helped Eddie with the study in St. Louis, the detraining study, that was about maximal oxygen uptake. So our first question was, if we give people beta blockers, what will it do to their maximal oxygen
I
uptake?
see.
Will there be a difference between trained and untrained people? We thought the trained people would be influenced more because they wouldn't be able to expand their stroke volume to make up for the reduced heart rate. And that proved to be the case, but not as much as we thought. So about that time, you move from cardiac output, thinking about cardiac output, to thinking about high muscle blood flow. So I got interested in skeletal muscle blood flow and what regulates skeletal muscle blood flow toward the end of medical school and as I was getting into my residency. And so really, that's been a pretty much continuous theme since that time. So for the last, say, 25, 30 years, VO2 max, cardiac output, skeletal muscle blood flow. But as you branch out and learn more, you recognize that if the skeletal muscle vasodilates too much, you can threaten blood pressure, so the autonomic nervous system has to come into
Kicks
play.
in, yeah.
And so you start thinking about the autonomic nervous system. Well, then that leads you to a whole new collection of things to explore. And once you start thinking about the autonomic nervous system, you think about sympathetic activity, you think about blood pressure regulation. As you think about VO2 max, you think about aging, skeletal muscle blood flow and
Yeah, I
aging.
can
So there's a
see
lot
how
of
it all-
different ways that these things fit together. And then as you think about these situations in athletes and in normal volunteers, you also think about what is happening to the patients. So I would say that those have been really, it's all linked to this original interest in kind of human performance, and maximal oxygen uptake, and has branched out from there. And then I've been curious enough and been in a situation where I had resources and enough support where I could take these kind of side trips.
Yeah.
Currently, we're quite interested in the idea that the carotid chemoreceptors, which are well known to sense oxygen levels in your blood, might also sense blood glucose. So that's been an interest, an idea that they may help you respond to hypoglycemia.
I see. Looking at ACSM,
Right.
and you've been to a lot of meetings.
You bet.
I guess first question, you probably are presenting at physiology meetings too,
Right.
as well as here.
You bet. And some medical stuff too, things that are more medical.
Okay.
Present both places,
Okay.
right?
So you're at least 3 different
Yeah.
areas there that are
Right.
interrelated to
You
your
bet.
work. And I guess the other question I have is that just sort of looking at, as a historian, the growth of exercise physiology.
Yeah, right,
I mean,
right.
you know, gee.
Well, and I think my own career kind of tracks kind of the later part of it. Individuals like Dr. Hollisley, Dr. Jerry Mitchell in medical environments had been doing very well. There were people like Tip, obviously, Carl Giussoffi, Phil Galnick, people like Dr. Wilmore and Dr. Kostel, who realized that you had to move out of this physical education
Yes.
model.
Yeah.
You know, that started to gain steam in the 60s and 70s, and I was kind of able to get there right as it really had picked up. And you've now gone from this kind of human performance elite athlete model to aging,
Public health.
a lot more stuff on public health.
Yeah.
Special populations with different kind of coexisting conditions. And I think what's been the great thing about ACSM is thinking really as from kind of a self-centered perspective. When you first needed to learn something, to begin to learn to present, how to do a poster,
Yeah.
how to really start to communicate your scientific ideas, it was a very welcoming environment, where it remains. And then as you kind of move up the academic food chain, you're able to chair a session, you're able to do this, give different
Have a
larger
session
talks.
or
Yeah,
whatever.
exactly. And I also think that again, the way the college has transitioned and keeping the focus on the athlete on one hand and very applied things, but also basic science, but public health,
Yes.
has been very helpful. I mean, some people would say, well, you know, it's maybe too broad-based and has lost some focus on this area or that area. But I think the breadth is actually a real strength.
I do too.
Because frequently ideas from one area inform ideas from another area.
Right. And of course you would agree, I know, the basic science foundation has
right.
always been there.
Right.
And
Well, I think we saw, you know, today there was an aging symposium where we had Amby Burfoot, who won the 1968 Boston Marathon, speaking. We had some tremendous human studies presented by Ben Levine and Scott Trappy, and then we had great animal data from Mark Tarnoplowski, and the extent to which the ideas really kind of fed off each other and were very kind of a positive serve and volley was terrific.
What a great session.
It was tremendous, yeah.
Wow.
But we see that all over the place.
Yeah, time and time again.
Yeah, all over the place.
Yeah. Quality.
Yeah, high quality.
And to a certain extent quantity, because it's
grown so much. And it's interesting, one of the guys who used to be a subject in our studies was a track coach in Tucson, later moved to Albion College to be the track and cross-country coach there. And so some young lady who just graduated from there is going to go down to Ball State and get a master's degree. And I was able to introduce her to all those people. But she said she was just shocked about how friendly everybody was.
Yeah, you hear that all the time.
Welcoming they were.
Like we were saying about the undergrads, if they would ever just try,
yeah,
everyone's very welcoming.
opening. Yeah, sure, you can work in the lab. Absolutely.
Yeah. Another thing I wanted to ask you and you mentioned Jerry Mitchell,
You bet.
and John Hallozy,
Right.
and is the fact that you did an MD degree, and I think at that transition period, it meant a lot to the field to have trained MDs.
Yeah, right.
You know,
Right.
you might not want to talk about yourself that way, but I think that was important. That
Well, you know,
here's individuals.
People like Ben Levine and I have this conversation all
Yeah,
the time.
yeah.
I think that it is important, and I think one of the real threats, not to ACSM so much, but to biomedical research in general, is the end of the clinician investigator. So you have a lot of people who are trained to be superb clinicians, and you also have people that are doing outcome studies and clinical trials and kind of quality and epidemiology that are physician scientists. But people who can take what individuals are finding in the basic science lab and find, you know, patients, normal volunteers, whatever, and test those hypotheses in a controlled laboratory environment,
Yes.
not in 100 or 1,000 people, to see if, you know, treatment A is better than treatment B, to find out, for example, in my own case, does nitric oxide cause vasodilation in skeletal muscle, to understand some of these other factors that are hypothesized to be such a big deal, and really try to understand how they operate in human biology. Critically important to have physician scientists there.
Right.
And because of the basic model of medicine and the way it's changing, we're really an endangered species.
Yeah, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, it's unfortunate for everybody, especially the patients.
Yeah, because they're not getting that application.
And the things we are thinking about, you know, now 5, 10, 15 years down the road will be you know, maybe therapeutic frontiers then. And the other thing is to help people put some of these larger population studies on the one hand and these animal studies on the other hand, to put them in some sort of context.
Yeah, like your session, or like the
Session
you
today,
mentioned.
perfect example.
Yeah,
Perfect
yeah.
example.
One quick question, final question. Time flies, I told you. I don't know if it's Rippey's term or not, lifestyle medicine,
Right.
Jim Rippey, but it just seems to me that a lot of what's going on, the way things are going,
Right.
that's a good thing. I mean, it sort of
Right.
plays into this health behavior.
Health behavior. Well, if
stuff
you look
and-
at it, Jack, you're a historian. You know that the way people die has really changed. You know, 100 years ago, the big killers were infectious disease.
Of course, now it's chronic.
Now it's chronic disease, and the infectious disease was not cured necessarily by vaccines and antibiotics. They got the tail end of it. 80% of it was fixed by cleaning up the sewers,
Public
cleaning up
health.
public health measures, sewers, waters, a little bit better nutrition,
Yep.
things like that. And so if you look at that model, and then you look at the recent successes with traffic safety and smoking, you look at it that way. And and again, the data is pretty clear cut. You know, if just 5 or 6 key lifestyle factors:
Yes.
don't smoke, stay physically active, don't get fat, stay socially engaged, try to eat a little bit better. Those 5 or 6 things really are the
Do
main
wonders.
determinants of 80 or 90% of health. And what happens in the hospital or the doctor's office is not as deterministic as people think.
I teach a history class called The Pursuit of Health.
Yeah, right.
And I talk about it, and one of the lines I use is that we die by the way we live.
Absolutely.
And it really catches their attention.
Well, one of the things you can look at the United States, and you look at kind of the gene versus environment lifestyle argument with our immigrant populations. At one level, the United States is the world's biggest randomized clinical trial for lifestyle and environment versus genetics, because you see as people move from their native country, their disease patterns shift from those in the native country to what we have in the United
the
States,
US,
to the extent that they adopt our lifestyle. So if you start eating like a typical American, you're going to die like a typical American. If you keep eating like a Japanese person, you'll die like a Japanese person.
And live longer.
Live longer and not be fat and so forth.
Yeah. Well, I could talk about this all day.
Yeah, absolutely. Me too.
Thank you, Mike.
My pleasure, Jack. Thanks so much.
Yeah, this was fun.
Good.